The policeman didn't think twice before arresting the black man in the park, but his world comes crashing down when he sees his boss saluting the arrested man. He soon discovers that he is an FBI agent. It was an ordinary afternoon in the park. James Cooper, a dark-skinned man with a steady gaze, sat on a bench in the shade of a tree, the book he held in his hands seeming more like an attempt to escape from the whirlwind of responsibilities his life demanded. For him, that park was a refuge. The greenery around him, the sound of the birds, the laughter of the children playing in the distance, all brought a momentary sense of peace. But something was about to break that tranquility. On the other side of the park, John Miller, a veteran policeman, was making his rounds. His gaze was sharp, always alert, ready to identify what he considered suspicious. 20 years on patrol had shaped Miller into someone who trusted his instincts, which wasn't always a good thing. And that day, his gaze fell on James. There he was, a black man, alone, too serene for Miller's taste. Something about him bothered the policeman, and even without a concrete reason, the discomfort began to grow inside Miller like a tide. He watched from a distance, every movement, every breath James took, trying to find something, anything, to justify the discomfort he felt. James, on the other hand, felt the weight of that gaze. He didn't have to lift his eyes from the book to know he was being watched. It was a familiar feeling, that constant discomfort of being judged before he even opened his mouth, of being reduced to stereotypes by people who didn't know him. He kept his posture, but inside a silent battle was raging. I won't give in. He wouldn't give Miller the pleasure of seeing any sign of weakness. What the policeman didn't know was that James had experienced this kind of situation many times before. He knew every step of this dance, where his skin color was the only crime committed. As the tension in the air increased, Miller made his decision. He doesn't belong here, he thought. He puffed out his chest, tightened his gun belt, and started walking towards James. His steps, once slow, gained pace. He felt in control of the situation, something that made him feel important. On the other side, James didn't need to look to know what was coming. He knew. As always, he knew. He closed the book calmly, marking the page with his finger. He wouldn't be taken by surprise, but a part of him could already taste the bitterness of the injustice to come. The sound of Miller's boots on the gravel came closer, and James's calm became a target. When the policeman stopped in front of him, the air seemed to thicken. The policeman looked down at him, assessing, waiting for a slip. "Good afternoon," said Miller, his voice carrying a tone that sounded more like a warning than a greeting. James raised his eyes slowly, unhurriedly, and stared at the man before him. There was no fear in his gaze, just a deep weariness, the kind that only those who have lived through years of silent struggle know, the kind of tiredness that needs no words to explain it. Miller continued to stare, waiting for something to justify the discomfort that was invading him. But James was calm, and that irritated him deeply. This wasn't how things were supposed to work. He had the power in this situation, and James's indifference undermined that, poked at something deeper. The silence between them was like a taut rope, ready to snap. Finally, the policeman broke the silence. "Can I see your ID?" he asked, as if he were dealing with someone he already knew was in trouble. The request for ID was just a disguise, an attempt to create a motive for escalation. James didn't answer straight away. He knew that refusing would be like pouring gasoline on a fire, but giving in without question would only fuel a cycle he knew all too well. For a moment, the surrounding park seemed to have disappeared. There were no more trees, no sound of children playing. Just two men in a nonverbal confrontation where one sought to assert power and the other refused to give in. The tension in the air was thick. It wasn't just the afternoon heat that made sweat form on James's forehead. He knew he was one step away from losing his peace, not because of anything he had done, but because of the simple fact that he was in the wrong place, at the wrong time, in the eyes of the wrong person. And then the inevitable happened. James took a deep breath and prepared himself. James took a deep breath, feeling the heavy air of the park invade his lungs. He knew exactly where this was going. He'd been there so many times that it was like following a familiar script. Miller's presence there, with that cold stare and his hand on his belt, made it clear what was about to happen. And anger began to bubble up inside him an anger that he tried to hold back, but that didn't dissipate easily. It was always like this. No matter what he did, no matter who he was, the world always insisted on reminding him that the color of his skin was a cause for suspicion. He looked at the policeman, measuring his words carefully, because deep down, James knew that the next step was crucial. Any slip-up, any wrong word, and he'd end up on the ground, in handcuffs, or worse. So he spoke slowly, his voice firm but controlled. "Am I under arrest?" This simple, direct question made Miller's face harden even more. Those words carried something that bothered the policeman, because James wasn't acting scared or guilty. He was calm, too calm, and that irritated him. It was as if Miller was losing control of the situation before it even began. "You will be if you don't cooperate," the policeman replied, almost spitting out the words, his hand already near his gun, as if the simple act of asking was a direct challenge to his authority. James felt a bitter taste in his mouth. Cooperate? Cooperate with what? He was sitting in a park, reading a book. What was criminal about that? But he knew there was no point in asking too many questions. The world had made it clear early on where he belonged. The silence weighed on him for a moment. He looked around. People seemed distant, oblivious to what was going on. Perhaps some were even watching, but no one approached. It was always like this, alone. James clenched the book in his hands, feeling his frustration grow. It never changed. It didn't matter that he was an FBI agent. It didn't matter that he had dedicated his life to protecting people, like that policeman. People who would never understand what it was like to live constantly under the weight of suspicion. At the end of the day, he was just another black man, and that's how the world saw him. Not wanting to make matters worse, he decided not to react. Slowly, with controlled movements, he reached into his pocket for his wallet. Every move was calculated because he knew very well how these things could end. He had seen friends, acquaintances, even strangers suffer the consequences of a sudden move, a wrong word. He wasn't going to give Miller that chance. When he handed his ID to the policeman, there was a moment of heavy silence. Miller looked at the document, but didn't really seem interested in what was written on it. He had already decided what he was going to do before he arrived. And at that moment, James felt a wave of indignation run through his body. He knew that no matter how many documents he handed over, no matter how many times he explained who he was, nothing would change. It wasn't about what he was doing there. It was about what he represented to Miller. Without any further questions, the policeman took a step back. "Stand up," he ordered, his hand going straight for the handcuffs. James looked at the policeman, and at that moment, what he felt was no longer just frustration. It was a deep fatigue, an exhaustion that came from years of facing the same kind of treatment. He knew what was coming next. He knew that, even though he was innocent, even though he hadn't done anything, he would be handcuffed there, in front of everyone. And there was nothing he could do to change that. He stood up slowly, keeping his hands in sight, as he always did in the situations like this. The metallic sound of the handcuffs echoed in the air, and as they closed around James's wrists, he felt the coldness of the metal bite into his skin. He couldn't resist. He had no reason to resist. But inside, indignation burned, mixed with a sadness that only those who have experienced it can understand. As he was led through the park, James could feel the eyes on him. He knew what people were thinking, the silent judgments they were making. And once again, he was reminded that, in that world, he was always guilty until proven innocent. Deep down, he knew that Miller would eventually find out who he really was. He knew it wouldn't last forever, but the weight of the situation was there, present, crushing his spirit, because no matter what the outcome, the damage had already been done. James had lost another piece of himself in that park, that day. And once again, the world moved on, indifferent. As James was led towards the car, the stares of the few people in the park weighed on him like stones. He held his heat high, but inside he felt a mixture of frustration and impotence growing like a tight knot in his throat. The handcuffs bit into his wrist, a sensation he knew well, but which never became any less painful. With every step, reality unfolded in his mind. Again, one more time. Officer Miller didn't say a word. He just pushed James forward, his hand firmly on his arm, as if he were dealing with a dangerous criminal. James knew that arguing would be useless. At that moment, he wasn't a man. He wasn't a respectable citizen. He was just an image, a suspicion built up in the head of a policeman who, with every passing second, demonstrated that his worldview was limited by the color of James's skin. When they reached the car, Miller pushed him inside with unnecessary abruptness. James remained calm, even though he felt the cold metal of the handcuff scrape against his skin. He watched in silence as Miller slammed the door shut and headed for the driver's seat. James was used to this feeling of helplessness, but that didn't make the situation any less devastating. Sitting there in the back of a police car, having done absolutely nothing wrong, made his blood boil inside. Looking out of the car windows was no consolation. The trees, once a sign of peace, now became blurs of green that passed all too quickly. The surrounding town continued to go about its routine, as if what was happening there was a small detail, an ordinary event. And in fact, for many it was. For most people, it was just another suspect being taken away by the police. No one would ask themselves if James was really guilty. No one would look twice at a black man being handcuffed in the middle of a park. For them, the scene was normal. James knew that. He knew that, for the majority, he was already condemned long before any evidence was presented. The weight of that reality was always there, present, and at that moment, he felt the burden more strongly than ever. He leaned his head back against the hard seat of the police car. As the vehicle drove through the city streets, a thought crossed his mind. How, after everything he had done, was he still seen like this? He had dedicated years of his life to public service, to the law. He was an FBI agent, someone trained to protect the country and, ironically, to protect people like Miller himself. But there, in the back of a car, he was none of those things. He was just another body in handcuffs, another name on a list of arrests for no reason. He looked at the handcuffs on his wrists and, for a moment, wanted to fight. He wanted to scream, to break free, to show Miller who he really was, to demand respect. But he knew that any move in that direction would only make everything worse. There was no room for resistance. Not in that context, not in that situation. In James's mind, the future was unfolding like a dark movie. He would be taken to the police station. He would have to explain who he was, prove his innocence, as he had done so many times before. And in the end, he would probably receive a cold, forced apology, while the policeman would justify himself with some lame excuse about procedure or precaution. And James would have to accept, with a fake smile, to avoid any more problems. All so that, the next day, it could happen again. That was the reality, and that reality was weighing on him more and more. When the car pulled up in front of the police station, James's heart was heavy, not with fear, but with a sadness that seemed to have no end. Miller opened the door, pulling him out with the same silent brutality. The policeman said nothing. He just led James into the police station as if he were merchandise to be processed. And even though he knew that everything would soon be cleared up, that his identity would be discovered, the humiliation was already etched into his skin. As he entered the police station building, a thought echoed in his mind. How did it come to this? How, after so much progress, are things still like this? The answer was simple and bitter. Some things never change, and James, once again, was living proof of that. James felt the stares as soon as he entered the police station, as if everyone there already knew something, but was waiting to see what would happen. He was taken straight to the processing area, the sound of footsteps echoing on the tiled floor. Each click of Miller's boots seeming like a reminder of what he represented at that moment, a suspect. The room was full, but there was an uncomfortable stillness in the air. The other officers glanced around, without really getting involved. It was as if they were all watching something ordinary, a routine that didn't deserve attention. James remained calm. He already knew that the truth would soon come out, but that didn't lessen the weight of what was happening. He had learned over the years that being innocent didn't always mean being treated as such. And there he was, a man with a respectable career, handcuffed, taken away as if he were guilty. The weariness in his chest was not just from the incident itself, but from all the times he had been reduced to his skin color. It was all a bitter reminder that even with his achievements, the world still saw him in a limited way. As Miller guided him to the identification desk, one of the officers, Jenkins, took his ID and looked at the name on the document. Jenkins, young and relatively new to the department, blinked a few times, recognizing the name before even associating it with the man in front of him. The silence between them became even heavier. Jenkins's hand shook slightly as he handed Miller back his ID. Captain Bennett is in the office. I think you'll want to talk to her before you go through with this, Jenkins said, trying to keep his voice steady, but making it clear that something was very wrong. Miller frowned, his jaw locking almost imperceptibly. He looked at James, then at the young officer, as if he didn't want to believe what was happening. But something there, in that name, began to move inside Miller. He didn't understand it immediately, but something didn't fit. There was a nagging feeling that he was about to make a bigger mistake than he realized. James remained silent, letting the situation unfold. There was no hurry, no need for explanations. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. Miller, with the stiffness of someone who still didn't fully understand, held James's arm tighter than he needed to and led him down the corridor to Captain Bennett's office. The door opened, revealing a middle-aged woman with a sharp gaze, someone used to dealing with difficult situations, but who had no patience for nonsense. She looked up from the pile of papers on the table, and as soon as she saw James handcuffed to the door, her expression changed. She knew who he was. Everyone there knew. Officer Miller, can you explain to me what's going on here? Her voice was firm, controlled, but there was a tone that indicated that this conversation was not going to be easy. Miller, still not fully understanding the mistake that was about to be revealed, took a nervous step forward. I arrested him in the park. He was acting suspiciously and... You arrested an FBI special agent? Her voice cut through the air like a blade. For a second, Miller's world seemed to freeze. James didn't have to say a word. He saw in the policeman's face the exact moment when the realization hit. Miller loosened his grip on James's arm, as if the weight of his action was beginning to crush him from the inside out. The penny was dropping, and with it came the harsh reality that hasty judgment and prejudice had led him to do something that could never be undone. Now, Captain Bennett stood up and motioned for Miller to release James. The sound of handcuffs being opened echoed in the room, but for James, the relief he felt wasn't sweet. He already knew how it would end. What he didn't know was how long he would have to go through situations like this. He rubbed his wrists, now free, but the mark of the handcuffs, both physical and emotional, was far from gone. I'm sorry about that, Agent Cooper, said Captain Bennett, her voice softer now. That shouldn't have happened. James shook his head, but not angrily. Sadness overwhelmed him more than any other feeling. It wasn't the first time this had happened, and he knew it probably wouldn't be the last. No matter how high he rose in life, no matter how important he was, for many he would still be just a black man, an easy target for unfounded suspicion. Captain, he said, his voice low, controlled, there's no need to apologize. I just want you to talk to Officer Miller. She understood. It wasn't about what he did or who he was. It was about what he represented to people like Miller. That was the real problem. James left the office with his shoulders tense, the weight of the injustice still firmly on his back. He knew that Miller would pay somehow, but the real price, the one that he, James, always paid, would not be compensated by apologies or promises. The damage had already been done, once again, and that damage hurt more than the handcuffs. As James left the office, Miller stood in the middle of the room, motionless. It was as if all the air around him had been sucked out, and he was finally beginning to feel the crushing weight of what had just happened. His head was spinning with a mixture of guilt and confusion, as if he was desperately trying to find a justification, a reason for what he had done. But there was nothing he could justify. He had arrested an innocent man, worse still, an FBI agent, and deep down he knew why. There was no escaping this truth. Miller left the room soon after, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the corridor, but this time his steps were different. There was no longer the firm, confident posture of the policeman who believes he is in control. There was a hesitation in every movement, a weight on his shoulders that he had never felt before. As he made his way to his desk, the voices around him seemed muffled, distant, The other officers who would normally have greeted him or commented on his tour now avoided him, casting quick, silent glances his way. They all knew. He sat back in his chair, his elbows on the table, and his hands clasped in front of his face. For a few seconds, he tried to rationalize what he had done. He was just following protocol, right? It was what he always did, what he had been trained to do. Identify suspects, maintain order, protect the community. But as these thoughts raced through his mind, another, more nagging voice emerged. A voice he had tried to ignore for years, but which was now there, shouting louder than ever. You knew. From the moment you saw him in the park, you knew he wasn't a criminal, but you arrested him anyway. Why? It was a question he didn't want to answer, but the answer was there, clear as day. Miller had acted on instinct, the same instinct that he thought protected him, that kept him safe on the streets. But now, looking at the facts, he understood that this instinct was nothing more than prejudice disguised as experience. He hadn't seen James Cooper, the man. He had only seen the color of his skin, and from then on, judgment was instantaneous. He had always told himself that he was different, that he was fair. But the naked truth was that he had been exactly what he had always hated to admit: prejudiced. Discomfort grew inside him. He had arrested an innocent man for nothing, based on nothing. A man who had shown no resistance, who had done nothing wrong except exist in a space where, in Miller's mind, he shouldn't be. Heat surged through his body, shame taking over. How had it come to this? On the other side of the police station, James was slowly walking away, leaving behind the silent chaos he had caused without even having to raise his voice. But for Miller, the impact of this mistake was only just beginning to reveal itself. He had lost control of the situation, but worse than that, he had lost control of himself. What had started out as a simple mistrust had turned into a mistake with consequences he couldn't even imagine. When Captain Bennett approached Miller's desk, he looked up, his face marked by confusion and regret. "Officer Harkins," she said, using his last name as a reminder that this was not a friendly conversation. "We need to talk." Miller knew that conversation wasn't going to be easy. He felt the noose tighten around his neck. Captain Bennett was not known for being complacent about mistakes of this kind, especially when they involved racial issues. And at that moment, he knew there were no excuses, no protocol that would save him. "Captain, I was just trying to do my job," said Miller, his voice weak. But he already knew that those words sounded empty, even to himself. Bennett crossed his arms, his expression serious and determined. "Your job is to protect and serve Harkins, isn't it? But what you've done is judge a man by his appearance, not by the facts. And that has no place in this department." With every word she said, the guilt inside Miller grew stronger. He wanted to talk. He wanted to find a way to explain, to justify himself. But the more he thought, the more he realized that there was nothing he could say. All he had was a wrong action, an irreversible mistake that was now about to cost him far more than he could ever have imagined. Bennett stared at him for a few seconds, the silence between them almost palpable. Finally, she sighed. "You're suspended, Harkins. While we do the internal investigation, you'd better start thinking about what you've done, because we're not going to tolerate this kind of behavior." Suspended. The word echoed in Miller's mind like a final blow. He looked down at his hands, the same hands that had handcuffed James Cooper for no reason, and the weight of guilt crushed him for good. What had he done? As Bennett walked away, leaving him alone with his thoughts, Miller understood that the real trial was yet to come, and that judgment would not come from his superiors, but from himself. Brian Miller sat at the table, completely motionless. The announcement of his suspension had just been made, but what hit him hardest wasn't the immediate punishment. It was the realization that, for the first time in more than 2 decades of service, he was being forced to confront the truth about who he really was behind the badge. He had always believed that he was on the right side of the law, that he was a defender of justice. But now every one of his steps, every decision, was being reviewed in his mind with painful clarity. The mistake he had made with James Cooper was not an isolated incident. He knew that. For years, he had justified his actions on the basis of instinct or experience. But at that moment, Miller realized that the real problem was not with the suspects he arrested, but with how he saw them. Standing up, still dazed, he began to collect the few belongings on the table. The sound of the police station radio, once a reassuring background noise, now seemed distant, a reminder of something that, until recently, had defined his life. He left his badge on the table, along with the car keys, and looked around one last time before leaving. Every face he encountered reflected a mixture of curiosity, disapproval, and for some, perhaps even pity. It was as if everyone there already knew that this mistake would be the end of his career. The way home seemed like an endless journey. The city he knew so well suddenly seemed different. The streets seemed emptier, the lights dimmer, and the feeling of displacement grew inside him. He had spent so many years patrolling those same streets, always believing he was doing good. But now every corner reminded him of his failings, of all the times when his view of the world had been distorted by prejudices he never wanted to admit. At home, the silence was even more unbearable. He sat in the living room chair, his gaze lost, while Captain Bennett's words echoed in his head. Protect and serve. But who had he really been serving all these years? He had failed, not just James Cooper, but everyone who crossed his path and was judged before they even opened their mouths. The guilt continued to gnaw away inside. The hours passed slowly as he tried to find some way of putting right what he had done. But the truth was harsh. There was no going back. He couldn't undo what he had done to James. The only thing left was the opportunity to learn, to change. That night, Miller could barely sleep. For the first time, he was forced to look in the mirror and see something he had avoided for years. The fact that he was part of the problem, that his view of the world, built up over decades of experience, was tainted by prejudices he refused to see. The next day, he was summoned to a meeting with Captain Bennett and those responsible for the internal investigation. The atmosphere was tense, full of expectation. The weight of the mistake hung over everyone. But Miller knew that this moment would be decisive, not just for his career, but for the way he would face life from now on. James Cooper was there too, sitting on the other side of the table, calm but with a quiet authority that Miller felt even though he didn't need to say anything. James's presence made the atmosphere even heavier, a constant reminder of all that had been lost that day in the park. Captain Bennett was the first to speak, recapping the events. With every word, Miller felt the weight of his actions falling on him like a hammer. But this time, he didn't try to justify himself. There were no excuses. He knew that. When the captain finally faced him, the silence dragged on for a long moment. "Officer Harkins, do you understand the gravity of what you've done?" Her voice was firm, but there was an undertone of something deeper, something that indicated that this wasn't just another case for her. Miller, for the first time, found the voice to answer. "Yes, Captain, I understand." Those words, simple as they were, carried a depth he could barely express. He wasn't just answering a protocol question. He was admitting, in front of everyone there, that he had failed in a way that he might never be able to correct. Silence returned to the room for a few more seconds, and then James Cooper spoke, his voice calm but full of undeniable authority. "Captain, before we make any decisions, I'd like to say something." Everyone turned to him. Miller, nervous, expected the worst. But what came next surprised him. "I'm not here to demand that Brian's career ends. I'm not here for revenge." James's voice was firm, but without anger. "I'm here to make sure that something like this never happens again. I could insist that he be fired, but I believe that true change doesn't come with the end of a career, but with the transformation of a person." Miller looked at James, confused, but at the same time a small spark of hope ignited inside him. He hadn't expected clemency, but there it was, being offered. Transformation. The word echoed in his mind. He didn't know if he deserved it, but there was the opportunity. Captain Bennett looked at them both, considering what had been said. She finally sighed and said, "The question here isn't just about a career, Harkins. It's about who you're going to be from now on. We can punish a mistake, but we can't force someone to change. That has to come from you." Miller knew that this was his chance, not just to save his career, but to change the way he saw the world, and more importantly, how he acted in it. The transformation he needed to make began right there, right then. And for the first time in a long time, he was ready to face it head on. In the days that followed that meeting, Brian Miller couldn't get James Cooper's words out of his mind. Transformation. It wasn't just about righting a wrong or trying to save what was left of his career. It was about becoming a different person, and that, he knew, wouldn't be easy. For years, he had been shaped by a worldview that put him at the center, that justified his suspicions and prejudices. But now, facing the abyss of his own failure, he finally saw how wrong he had been. The suspension was still in place. He had time. Time to reflect, time to look in the mirror and begin to understand how and why it all happened. Brian spent days thinking, reviewing every decision he had made, every approach he had taken over the years. He began to notice patterns, moments when he had acted more out of fear than reason, when his prejudices had spoken louder than the facts. The harsh truth he had always avoided was finally clear. He was part of a system that often failed to protect those who needed it most. That same week, he received a call from Captain Bennett. She wanted him to come back to the police station for another meeting, this time with the team that had been tasked with overseeing the changes in the department. Brian didn't know what to expect. Part of him still feared the worst. But something inside him, a tiny spark, began to grow. Maybe, just maybe, there was still hope. When he arrived at the police station, it felt strange. Everything looked the same, but he felt different. His colleagues watched him in silence, still judging, still waiting to see what would come of it. He knew his reputation was in tatters, but for the first time, he didn't care what anyone thought. The important thing was what he would do from then on. In the meeting room, James Cooper was present once again, sitting next to Captain Bennett and some high-ranking officers. The atmosphere was serious but not hostile. There was a different energy in the air, as if everyone there was looking for a solution, not just to the mistake that had been made, but to the bigger problems that everyone knew existed, but no one wanted to face. Captain Bennett was the first to speak. "Brian, we're here to discuss the next steps. This department is going through changes, and those changes start with each and every one of us. We know that what happened to James Cooper was not an isolated case. It's part of something much bigger, something we need to resolve. But before we make any decisions about your future here, we want to know one thing. Are you willing to change?" Brian looked around the room, feeling the weight of the question. It wasn't just a question of saving his position. It was a question of committing to real change. He knew that this was an opportunity to do something different, to be someone different. "I am," he replied, his voice firm. "I know I failed. I know I made a serious mistake, but I'm willing to learn, to improve, and to make sure that something like this never happens again. I don't want to be the kind of policeman who acts on prejudice. I want to be better than that." James Cooper kept his gaze fixed on Brian. There was no malice, no rancor, just a careful analysis, as if he were weighing up the words and intentions of the man in front of him. After a few seconds, James nodded slightly, a sign that he was willing to give Brian a second chance. "That's what matters," said James, his voice calm but full of authority. "This transformation doesn't happen overnight, but the fact that you recognize it is a start. What happened to me can't be erased, but if you're really committed to this change, maybe we can make sure it doesn't happen to someone else." Captain Bennett then took the floor. "Brian, you'll be under strict supervision for a period. We're going to put you through intensive training programs on racial prejudice, approaching suspects and de-escalating conflicts. But make no mistake, this isn't just about following rules. It's about changing the way you see the people you're sworn to protect. If you can do that, maybe there's a future for you in this department." Brian took a deep breath. It was a long and difficult road ahead, but for the first time he felt he was on the right track. He knew that every day would be a struggle, not just to restore his credibility, but to prove himself as someone different. But he was willing to face it, because deep down, he knew that this was the only way to truly redeem himself. As he left the meeting, the air seemed a little lighter, despite the weight of the responsibility he carried. James Cooper walked beside him in silence. When they reached the door, James stopped, turning to Brian. "Remember what I said, Brian," he began, with a calm that only someone who had lived through many moments like that could have. Transformation isn't something you do because of what others expect of you. It's something you do because you know it's right. Brian nodded, absorbing those words. He knew it would be a long process, but he was ready for the challenge. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something different. It wasn't just guilt or regret. It was something deeper, something he barely recognized. Hope. As James walked away, Brian looked at the police station, the place that had been his identity for so long. Now he understood that being a policeman wasn't just about carrying a badge or following rules. It was a greater responsibility, a promise to protect everyone, without distinction. And from that moment on, he promised himself that he would live up to that responsibility, not out of obligation, but because it was the right thing to do. Renewed, he took a deep breath and began the long road back to becoming the policeman he had always believed himself to be, but who was now finally beginning to understand what it really meant.